I always enjoy starting on time. And do you have already a microphone available for the discussions? I'm going to reverse the things a little bit. I'm going to ask people in the audience to just briefly introduce themselves so we know who's in the audience. Can we just ask the audience, and why are you in this session? If you can just say one sentence, that would be great. Just pass the microphone to everyone.
Thomas Johansson, Lund University, generally interested in these topics.
Okay.
The same interest, Kent Nyström from World Bioenergy Association.
Right.
Pilve Song from Asian Development Bank. I'm interested in learning something about the power grid integration.
Dozo.
Please. I am Nomura from Private Equity Fund in London. This is, as Son-san has spelled out, this is an important theme. I have taken interest in listening to you. Thank you.
Banker. Private equity, yes. Okay.
In Japanese, I'm Notoyo of Tokyo Metropolitan Government. At present, in the city, because of the earthquake, we have lost the power supply. So in the region, for the renewable energy in conjunction with the local cities, renewable energy, we'd like, in order to utilize this for Tokyo's electricity needs, we have to study the better way for the transmission of the electricity. That, with this in mind, I'm participating in this session. Same here from TMG. I am a Tabata from Environmental Department of Tokyo Metropolitan Government. Because of the shortage of electricity in Japan, we have drawn attention in this aspect. I would like to learn from A to Z. With this in mind, I have participated. Thank you for this opportunity.
I work for Sharp Corporation, and I'm promoting Mega Solar System as a sales division.
Thank you.
My name is Nay. I work at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I'm also with the International Solar Energy Society, and I'm here because my work at NREL is on power grid integration issues.
Thank you. Judy, delightful to see you.
Thank you. I'm Judy Hill-Lovins. I'm here as a full-time volunteer for Rocky Mountain Institute and Amory's lucky wife. And I'm very much appreciating learning more all the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Wilson Rickerson with Meister Consultants Group. We work with a lot of U.S. cities and also run into this issue all the time as a barrier that may or may not exist. We're also doing a lot of work with remote islands, and a lot of the power grid integration challenges there seem to be writ small what a lot of the bigger countries are running into.
My name is Yuri Ondera. I work for the environmental non-profit Friend of the Earth, and I do work on Fukushima nuclear issues, but in the overall picture of the energy reform happening in Japan now.
Hi, I'm Todd Porter, co-founder of Impact Foundation Japan and TEDx Tokyo.
And why are you here?
Because to make impact, you have to look at the whole ecosystem, and energy is a core part of that, as well as the social innovation and entrepreneurship that goes along with that.
Thank you.
My name is Mizuko Uchida, coming from Spanish Embassy. We are very interested in this subject, power grid integration, because as you may know, Spain is very advanced in this market. So we are now thinking about what kind of proposal we could do for Japanese government. So we are very interested in this subject.
Muchas gracias.
De nada.
I'm working for Tokyo Metropolitan Government. I'm in charge of renewable energy. I'm interested in grid to promote renewable energy.
Okay.
Just introduce myself.
Yes, please.
Sugimoto from Solar Frontier. I'm working in the PV module makers. So just we start from the new CIS, new type of solar panels. So just I intend to attend this meeting to catch up there to how to harmonize of their electric distribution network and just home network. It's very difficult to communicate each other.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I am the least qualified person to sit in this chair. I know nothing about supergrids. I'm not even an engineer. I know very little about electricity. And you should always apply with me what Buddha said to his followers as well. Don't trust a word what I'm saying. Check it and double check it all the time. My role here is to be the moderator, to be the timekeeper, and like most of us, to learn from the wisdom that's here on the table. I've asked our friends to combine their efforts, and we'll start with Amory, so that you can... We'll go on with Boo, Steve Sawyer, and Mr. Saito, and then we'll have a discussion, because they really are going to be very complementary in their presentations, and then we will dive into, I would say, two innovative proposals. So without any further delay, Amory, please, inspire us.
Thank you. I want to mention...
Microphone.
Oh. I want to mention two topics. The first about grid integration, the second about the architecture of the grid. We are often told that only big thermal stations can keep the lights on because they are somehow 24/7, while wind power and photovoltaics are variable and hence we're told unreliable. But actually, no generator is 24/7. They all fail. Nuclear and coal plants fail about 10 to 14% of the time. Then they lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often for weeks or months and without warning. And grids routinely handle this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. But grids can then handle the variability, the forecastable variability of solar and wind in just the same way. And my team's hourly simulations have shown that very large renewable fractions can deliver highly reliable power when they're forecasted and integrated and diversified by both type and location. Here's an example from Texas using real data. After efficiency reduces and makes less peaky the summer loads, we can install wind and solar power, wind in green, solar in yellow, and they will not exactly match the load. But flexible demand and the smart charging and discharging of electrified automobiles can mesh all of the moving parts, even with, in this case, 86% of the electricity coming from variable renewables. And that fraction goes up when we use even more of the demand response resource. In this case, we are using 86% wind and solar, no bulk storage, only distributed storage in cars, ice storage on all the air conditioning, but none of the other roughly 2/3 of the demand response resource. And the other 14% of the annual electricity can come from dispatchable renewables, everything except wind and photovoltaics. Now, some utilities, of course, already integrate variable renewables in this way, and that's how 4 German states last year got 43 to 52% of all their electricity from wind power. So this choreography serves steady loads reliably, not in the traditional way, giant fossil-fueled and nuclear stations, but with newer resources that meet even better the classical criterion for so-called baseload plants, namely, they are the plants which have the lowest operating cost, so they are dispatched whenever they're available. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is the architecture of the grid. There is, as we've seen, no real need for big thermal stations. And reliable supply comes from the total portfolio of generators, not from any single generating unit. When you have a diversified portfolio of more and smaller units, they're not all likely to fail at the same time. And also, if they're closer to the customers, the risk of failure goes down a lot. But the centralized grid we have has serious resilience and reliability concerns. Indeed, in the United States, 98 or 99% of all power failures start in the grid. So if we generated at or near the customers, we would have a 50 or 100-fold increase in reliability immediately. Now, the latest thinking and practice in this area is netted islandable microgrids, which normally connect with the big grid around them, but can stand alone if necessary. Islandable, of course, means that the building or factory can operate by itself if necessary, and therefore big cascading failures become impossible by design because the architecture of the grid is to break apart into fractal pieces, each of which has a reasonable supply-demand balance, at least for critical loads. And the failure modes are much more graceful, it turns out, for renewable-dominated portfolios, and they are less vulnerable to extreme events, whether typhoon or earthquake or tsunami or terrorism or geomagnetic storms, which are inevitable and will take down any centralized grid that we now know. I want to end with two short other points. First, that we should compete new transmission proposals against efficient use, distributed generation, and demand response. This will indeed become the policy in the United States. I've looked at 3 such analyses there, and it turned out that just end-use efficiency could do the job of a new transmission line at least 10 times over and at about 1/3 the cost, but without the vulnerability to disruption. In the case of Desertec, we found that if you put photovoltaics not in the North African desert but on the roofs in southern Europe, there is less sun but less cost and loss in the transmission lines, so the cost ends up being the same, but the resilience is much better. And therefore, I think the supergrid concept proposed in Japan would work, and it merits careful study. It may be a good idea, but also practical would be alternative distributed architectures that could yield greater resilience and flexibility, possibly lower cost and faster deployment, and I think it's too early to judge which approach is best. They should all be looked at in competition and comparison with each other. And my last point is a very simple one for the peculiar Japanese situation of the 2 grids. Cities like Montreal in Canada and Los Angeles in California and several others actually changed the frequency of their grids around 1950, and they did it very smoothly at very low cost. They changed from 25 or sometimes 40 or 50 hertz to 60 hertz. And I think that history could be very interesting to look at in Japan. It should, if anything, be easier now, because now a lot more of our loads are electronic and have a rectifier in the front, so they don't care about frequency, whereas in 1950, almost all the loads were asynchronous motors, which had to be rewound. But you may not know of this detail of our history, and it could turn out to be quite interesting to look at the logistics of how it was done, neighborhood by neighborhood, and it was all over with within weeks or months in each area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amory. We're, as I said, not having discussion after each speaker. We'll have the 4 speakers in Bo Mark, will take this visionary perspective into the European context with a reflection on China.
So, thank you very much. I would like to give a little idea what is happening, in fact, with the European supergrid, and also put it in perspective. So to start with, I show this slide just to show that things have happened. I worked with ABB for 30 years. In 1992, a researcher in ABB developed this idea of building a 100% renewable system for Europe. And that slide was not allowed to be published for 10 years. It was too drastic. Then, of course, other things have happened.
By whom too drastic?
By, if I call it management in general terms. No, we can take that later. Today, of course, there are very many plans, and we'll hear more about Desertec later. But what this is all about, because I certainly agree with Armour that we have to look at the different alternatives, and the solution will be a combination of alternatives. But I think it's very important when you look at the energy system for Europe, for instance, because after all, Europe is from a geographical standpoint quite small. And if we look at the total resources we have in Europe today, we have, of course, hydro. We have hydro storage, not the least, because the rings, blue rings, indicates hydraulic storage. And just as an indication, 70% of the total storage capacity of Europe for hydraulic storage is in two countries, Norway and Sweden. Unfortunately, 50% is in Norway and 20% in Sweden. So, of course, when we are going to expand the grid, a lot of people are looking at how can we combine this into building the best system. And that has led to the ideas of building a North Sea grid. Then the term supergrid started being used some years back. I would say probably like 5 to 8 years back. And the whole idea with the supergrid, when this was brought up, was to combine interconnecting various countries and markets with offshore wind power. That was the whole starting point of our talking about the supergrid. And also, of course, building on land-based. But now if we concentrate on the offshore grid, and we can look at what's going on. Next. Because it's interesting, this map I've taken from EVEA. And today you will find very, very similar maps are drawn by EVEA, by Greenpeace, and even by the TSOs around the North Sea. Because we all now seem to share the similar idea that we should to tap the vast resources, potential resources of offshore wind in the North Sea by also extending a grid. But this is not a fiction. It's actually, some of this is already built. You see all the red lines are already built. The yellow ones are under construction, and the blue are planned. And to give you one example, there is a red line going from Norway down to Holland, and that is a cable that was built some 5 years ago. And that turned out to be the most profitable investment ever made in the grid, because it combines the hydraulic resources in Norway with thermal loads in Holland. And the idea is very simple. In nighttime, you send power up to Norway and keep the water. And then in the daytime, you sell power down to Holland. So Norway is making money 2 times. Again. Next. So, yeah, I'm Swedish, yeah. I'm not jealous of Norway, by the way. They deserve it after all these tough years. But this is to also to show that when we talk about the supergrid in the North Sea, it's not a plan. It's actually expansion is ongoing. And if I look at ongoing projects today, there are 9 projects built. Total length of the cables is 1,900 kilometers. Investment is 4.2 billion euro, and total capacity is 7.6 gigawatt. I will finish up by saying I've talked about Europe, but I mean, Son talked about building something here in Asia, and I just showed my last slide is I don't think we need to worry about what will happen in China, because this is the actual plan, what will be built in China between 2010 and 2020. A lot of this is already on the way. Each of the red lines indicate a transmission capacity between 3 and 7 gigawatts per line. And it's planned to add another 217 gigawatt of capacity in the next within 10 years. And you see that the length of these lines are between 2,000 and 3,000 kilometers. And technology today allows to transmit 7 gigawatt over 3,000 kilometers with losses that are like 6%. It's a fantastic, so technology is there. And if we then talk about building Asian grid, I think what is missing is actually probably some grid that should be in the sea, connecting the four countries. On land, it will happen. Thank you.
To Bangkok.
What?
There's one going to Bangkok.
One, oh yes, one to Bangkok also.
And they're connected with Vietnam as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and very, very interesting. And so I would like to ask Steve, you know, from your perspective, could you fill in some of the thoughts that have been presented to us here?
Yeah. Very briefly, I mean, as the wind industry expands around the world, there's always in every country a big discussion about the grid and about managing variable sources and forecasting and extra expense and backup power and all sorts of concepts which are really missing the point in a fundamental way, because what we're really talking about in places like Denmark and Sweden and increasingly in Spain and increasingly in other parts of the world is not, in fact, an integration of renewable energy into the grid, but a transformation of the total energy system. And I hesitate to say that when sitting next to Amory, because I believe his new book is going to be the book that one should read to understand what I mean by that. He said more eloquently than I ever could, but just to give an example of that transformation, there's really a breaking down of the traditional boundaries between electricity, heat, and transport, or heating and cooling and transport, which we see the beginnings of that in Denmark, not only with the much discussed introduction of electric vehicles as a storage medium. So you're combining the heat, the power system and transport, but also in something which seemed incredibly counterintuitive to me, which was the notion of, everybody knows the story, or people should know the story, about how in Denmark, in western Denmark, on windy nights in the winter, they have about 110 to 120% of total electrical supply supplied by wind. Now, the Nord Pool is one of the Scandinavian electricity pool is one of the really functioning international electricity markets in the world. And at that point in time, on those windy winter nights, the price of wind power sold onto the Nord Pool becomes very close to zero. So the operators in Denmark said, well, what can we do with this? We can heat up the water in the central heating systems, in the central and district heating systems in Copenhagen and Friedrichshafen and other big cities that have these systems. Now, normally you would say, from an efficiency point of view, heating water, a friend of mine named Andy Sterling used to always say that heating water with electricity was like cutting butter with a chainsaw. And taken just by itself, I think that's true. But in this case, the most sensible thing to do with that surplus wind energy is to heat up the central and district heating systems in the cities in Copenhagen. And that's just one of the first examples of the kinds of new thinking that we need to engage in order to move to a 100% renewable energy system. Supergrid has become a term that's sort of like sustainable development. It means whatever the speaker wants it to mean. But I think in general terms, we have to not only think about big transmission lines between countries, but if we're going to have a modern, effective, functioning, integrated energy system, you need three basic components, and they're going to be different everywhere. You will need strong transmission, at least if you're going to integrate any large quantity of wind from remote locations. You, most importantly, need a coherent and flexible and diverse market-based system to allow the forces of the market within a carefully regulated framework to actually allow for the buying and selling and trading of electricity, heat, and transport fuel, which in this case will hopefully be mostly electricity, in the most effective way possible. And, of course, you need the famous demand-side management, active control of the system so that you can manage that variability. So I think in the end what we're talking about is a transformation of the electricity system, but also the broader heating and cooling and power and transport systems from a system that was very much like a 19th century telephone system, where you had Mabel the operator sitting in there pulling one plug out of one slot and pushing it into another in a tree and branch structure, to something that much more closely resembles the World Wide Web. And let us not forget the genesis of the World Wide Web. It was developed by the American military to create a communication system which would survive a nuclear strike. In other words, infinitely more robust and secure than the traditional electricity system. Now, in this room and in this conversation, we get pretty far ahead of the game of where the actual conversation is in most places. It's nice to go to Samsung or other places where these conversations are very advanced and actually things are being implemented, but usually spent the last 6 or 7 or 8 years battling with State Grid in China, who basically, started off from the point of view where they completely ignore wind because it's insignificant, and then they say, well, it can only be 2%. And now they're having to deal with the fact that in some parts of the country it's 25, 30, 40%, particularly in Inner Mongolia, and they don't like it very well. So there's a big struggle going on there. But they're coming along, as has Red Electrica in Spain, as has certainly Energinet in Denmark and the other Scandinavian operators, and in some parts of the United States as well. If you divide the problem into hardware, software, and wetware, we have the hardware. That's pretty clear. The software is developing rapidly. The most difficult thing to change, and the one we really have to focus our efforts is on the human operators of the system. And if we can convince them, then we have the rest of the tools to transform the energy system to 100% renewables. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I'd like to invite Tetsuya Saito to fill in that perspective from the Japanese point of view.
Hi. Thank you for your introduction. I would like to talk about the Japanese status vis-a-vis the electricity conditions in Japan at this point of time. Then I would like to lead us to the upcoming discussion. And now I would like to show you here, in particular, about the onshore potentiality of the wind energy. Therefore, society, with the consideration for the social constraints, as a result, we have seen. And in terms of the business operation ability, if the average wind speed is more than 6.5 meters, then 144 gigawatt is available as a capacity. On the left-hand side at the bottom, you see this is the utility company's capacity in the red curve. Looking at this, is learned that we have a windy area in Hokkaido, which is the strongest wind power. The Hokkaido Power Electric Company has a 7 gigawatt based operation. That is a capacity. Against this, about 10 times greater potentiality is there. So it's difficult to make the best use of everything, but how best you can utilize this is one big question. And the third one from Tokyo, from left in Tokyo, 65 gigawatts facility capacity is there, but unfortunately only few is used. So in Tokyo, Kansai region, there are many people living, so rather in these regions, solar potentiality is to be maximized, is to be utilized to the maximum degree. That's what we think. Under the current circumstances, each utility company's capacity, when it is limited to the capacity, and if you total the red and the blue line, then the potentiality is reduced to 58 gigawatt. If you are limited by the capacity, if the development rate is 50%, we have on ground 30 gigawatts is possible on the onshore basis. Next. Of course, it is true with offshore wind energy. In case of the offshore energy, the average wind speed is greater than 7.5 meters. It will increase the facility expense. That's if you increase the wind speed by 1 meter. In the same way, as you see, 600 gigawatts is available. In Japan, total is 200 gigawatts total capacity. So all Japanese electric company on a kilowatt basis, it is greater by 3 times. In Hokkaido, Tohoku, Kyushu, they are concentrated. This is concentrated in 3 regions, same as before. Each utility companies, if we are limited by the utility company's capacity, then it comes down to 115 gigawatts. 100 gigawatts, excuse me. So how best you can utilize this electricity? Well, I would like to say as to when you ask for the interconnection with the power utility company, this is based upon the bidding.
I think we need to look at Tohoku, Hokkaido, and Kyushu. That's where the operators are concentrated. And when we look at the electricity in Japan, there are 10 EPCOs. And up to now, the respective EPCOs had been maintaining their frequency stability. So that was what was in the law. And of course, within their territory, they will be in charge in maintaining and stabilizing the frequency. So that's a very important point. But in the future, when we think of solar and also wind energy, such renewable energy increasing in the share, it's necessary to be able to use whatever is the best for the different regions in different parts of Japan. I think that mindset needs to change. And Spain, I love Spain, actually. And Spain, they always have the mindset of how, what to do to get the best. And we are learning from others and overseas experiences and to see how we can change our mode of operation to maximize renewable energy. And last slide, please. Now, another point. Wind power. It's often said that there is a fluctuation in output leading to instability in frequency. But if you look at the Tohoku EPCO area, there are 12 wind farms. And when you look at the output, and JWPA had analyzed the results, and now the fine line, it may be a bit difficult to see this, but there are very fine lines shown here. And you see there is very minute fluctuations, but when you add them up, you get the red line. So in the 12-hour span, there's not much fluctuation. Of course, if you look at wider perspective, there may be days where there's no wind, etc. But if you look at the very fragmented time frames, it's not that fluctuated. There's a smoothing effect. And coming back to the fact that each EPCO was taking care of stabilizing their own area and territory, in order to realize this, we should look at the output of the respective wind farms. And as a result, at the respective EPCOs, the installed capacity, 5% of that is considered to be the maximum of grid interconnection in wind power. So if many wind farms and with the interconnection with PVs, not just certain region, we hope that we can enlarge that to not just certain regions, but to Japan as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we've had 4 contributions, and I would like to invite the audience to make some comments, ask some questions from any of these 4. And then we'll move on to, let's say, to more innovative contributions. Yes, please.
Is there a kind of inherent conflict between the distributed model and the kind of supergrid model, or do they all just get along down the road sometimes you hear folks planting a flag in one piece of ground or the other with no middle ground. But I guess what's the view of the panel? Is there middle ground? Should there be middle ground? Do we need everything? Do we need one thing?
Bo?
Well, I think the best example of that, I think, is probably Denmark. I mean, they have a large penetration of wind already, and in Denmark, they have certainly decided they need all three. Of course, there is a middle ground, and I also think that, I mean, there will be some competition between them, and exact distribution will be determined how efficient these solutions can be applied. But just to give you one example, I mean, there's also an exaggerated picture of how expensive the grid is, because in Germany, for instance, they have looked at all possible grid expansions that are needed to build the renewable system for Germany. And if you add everything up, it amounts to 0.3 cent per kilowatt hour on the tariff. That's all. But there will be a combination for sure.
I would agree, but I think the thing you have to look at is by location, by resource and demand. And some places will not need much transmission interconnection with larger, more remote power sources. Others will need a lot. And it depends very much on the geography, on the demand profile, and what resources are available. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and I think that's one of the things that makes this grid conversation so difficult is every system is in fact different and probably is inherently different and will be, even though it will share many common characteristics and many common technologies. So we can probably imagine a place that could survive on local hydro and PV without the need for anything else. But that's not very many places in the world.
Microphone. I think I agree with all of the comments so far, even if they may seem not entirely consistent. This discussion is very active in my own country, where, for example, it was long assumed that you need to put solar power in the desert southwest because that's where the most sun is, and you need to capture wind in the Dakotas and Montana because that's where the most wind is, and then you would haul them very long distances to the load centers, just as here we heard in Saito Sensei's data that most of the wind is in Hokkaido and Tohoku, and most of the load is Kanto and Kansai. On the other hand, we then found that, for example, rather than taking high plains wind to the Chicago area, just offshore Chicago in the middle of Lake Michigan is a similar or better wind potential, and you would have to pay extra for the submarine cable and the marine engineering and the ice engineering, but it's much closer, and the line is shorter and much less vulnerable. It has less resilience issue than the very long lines to the high plains. And when you net it all out, it may well be that you should go for the second best resource. This is especially true for wind as we get new kinds of turbines that are very efficient at lower wind speeds and give very high capacity factors. So the supply technology also is evolving in a way that will compete with long lines. And I think it's just too early to say how this competition will play out. But it is clear, even in relatively efficient Japan, that as we make especially the buildings much more efficient and do even more distributed generation, solar and otherwise, and more micro cogeneration, and more demand response, those will free up a lot of existing transmission capacity. And I'm sure that when I look at that China map, when this competition really takes place in China, we will find that many of those big lines are not actually necessary and not economic. So the reflex is always to build big lines, and we probably need some of them. But how many we will need, how many make economic sense, and especially how many preserve resilience in the face of geomagnetic storms and other things, these are open questions that I think need much more careful consideration.
First thing we need is a market in China. If we had an electricity market in China, then a lot of this conversation would be moot.
May I ask the audience for any other questions? Yes, please. Please state who you are.
Thank you very much. WWF Japan, and I'm in charge of climate change. My name is Masako Konishi. And WWF in 2050 would like to see 100% renewable energy. We have a report saying that it's feasible. And now in Japan, we're trying to see how we can realize that in Japan. We're trying to create a scenario. And the biggest headache that we have is, as Saito-san was referring to, now FIT is finally in place, but the interconnection, the right to deny interconnection is still with the EPCOs. So when you look at the regional situation, now we have 10 areas and they have their monopoly in the specific regions, and there are cases when such transmission area cannot be used. And as Saito-san said, though there's maybe high potential in Hokkaido, now there could be limitations to what could be done. And now in climate change, when you look at 2020, Japan, reduction of 25% of CO2 target in place. We want to reduce that, and we want to see how renewable energy can develop and try to create a world without fossil fuel.
On a long and mid-term basis, as was mentioned in Europe, a supergrid that is Japan-centric, DC. Maybe we should have a power supply attached to it. On a short-term basis, we have a transition to go into the long-term perspective while achieving the CO2 reduction requirement. At the same time, the Japanese RE energy, while in the form of enhancing the current electricity system. What is the approach? Could you give us your advice in this regard in the transition period?
Responding. Well, let's Saito-san.
Hi.
Yes. On a short-term basis, so we have to expand the transmission. It would take, however, 10 years. So first, on a short-term basis, what we can say that can be done, that now each utility company, within the utility company, so it doesn't have to be the separation of the transmission generation. But in Japan, we have completed the weather forecast system, meteorological forecast system. In Japan, they don't know the utility company. They don't know when the wind will blow. As a margin, they set this aside. So if this is 24 hours before, a few hours before the forecast, if forecast can be made, then you can ask the next door neighbor for the help. So that utility company to utility company, the interconnection will be increased as well. So as for the supergrid, the base is that if you make a road and draw the transmission line, it's not all there is to it. What is the fluctuation? And how much you can generate the power with the wind and solar energy, you are not able to have a good control. Firstly, you have to make the use of what is available, and you have to, based upon the development to complete the weather forecast system. I think it is the easiest way and fastest way. And also recently, in relation to the wind system, that you can control the output or the inclination can be controlled. That is possible with the available technology for the wind power generation. So including these controlled capabilities in the construction of the utility company, so I think it is one way for us to go into one of the enhancing capabilities in the future. I'm Kikuchi of Desertec. I think this question is very interesting because, generally speaking, based upon the current situation to 2050, the renewable energy 100% to be achieved. Yes, we talk a lot about this, but in the meantime, in the transition period, what to do is not much discussed nowadays yet. So most likely, if you abandon the nuclear power, I think it is going to the different direction of CO2 reduction. Inose Naoki of Tokyo Metropolitan Government, when he was a governor, so they tried to make the gas converter system, combined system. So while reducing the CO2 emission, you would move to the RE usage. I think this is what is to be realized in the transition period. And also CCS, we have a carbon dioxide capture and storage system. We have a CCS technology that is at the cement plant or steel plant, when the CO2 is generated, try to capture the generated CO2. This technology is to be pursued more, so that in the transition period, many technologies can be mobilized at the same time to reduce the CO2 emission. To cope with the CO2 emission, I think that is very important in the transition period by making use of available technologies.
One of the things that remains a mystery to me in Japan is why we are told that solar and wind power cost 2 or 3 times as much here as in other industrial countries with similar solar and wind resources. And I think a lot of this is related to the comfortable monopolies that the utilities have enjoyed and the lack of competition. So my dream for Japanese policy framework is very simple, that all ways to save or produce energy should be allowed and required to compete fairly at honest prices, regardless of which kind they are, what technology they use, where they are, how big they are, or who owns them. We are very, very far from this system. But the economic benefit of achieving it would be enormous. I think the one indication of how this works is in 13 of the United States now, saving electricity is allowed to bid in the same auctions as supplying electricity. And in one of our big power pools, the last auction was 94% won by demand-side resources, which were not previously allowed to compete. But now they can. And, of course, this lowers the market clearing price that everybody pays and drives more competition on the supply side.
Very good. Please. And we have a last comment, Steve.
Yeah, I think the unbundling is inevitable and ultimately necessary. I heard yesterday people saying that it was going to take 10 years, but okay, but you have to start now. In the long term, it's absolutely fundamental. Otherwise, a market can't function. And eventually, as Amory and others described, that's what you need. As a first step, let me suggest a tactic that we used with the Brazilians to convince them that wind was not just some boutique toy for rich countries. Is we took the minister and the head of the Energy Research Institute, etc., and brought them to Spain and set them down in the Red Electrica Control Center, just south of Madrid. And they can watch how the system operator manages up to 53% once, but, you know, not unusually up to 30 or 35% variable wind power in the system. They do it with day-ahead forecasting, up to 48-hour forecasting, demand-side management a bit, and all the rest of it. And it's for people who like central planning. It's like something out of Star Trek. Big control room, lots of TV screens, lots of buttons to push. Everybody, it impresses the hell out of them, and it's all basically to accommodate wind power. And Red Electrica has in effect become one of the greatest advocates for increased uptake of renewables, whereas 10 years ago they were saying that they couldn't possibly have any more than 2 or 3% on their system. So get a study trip of the right people to the control center in Madrid.
And the last auction, I believe, in Brazil was won by wind power, right?
Oh. The question of denial of connecting renewable to the grid is not only in Japan, it's in many countries. The most efficient countermeasure I've seen to that is the system in Germany, where the transmission system operator is obliged by law to have the interconnection ready when the renewable is ready to connect. If they don't have it ready, they even have to pay loss of revenues. And that has turned out to be very efficient.
And in China, although it's not enforced yet, the law says that they must pay twice the price until they connect.
Another question from the audience? Yes, Sean, all the way in the top.
Hi, thank you. My name's Sean, and I run a small clean tech firm. My question is very simple. What's the difference in price between submarine HVDC cable, including the price of actually installing it and maintaining it, and then land-based? I'm just trying to get a rough idea of how these things fall out.
Who knows the numbers? Bo.
Well, the first answer it varies, but if you want to get an average figure, it's the same, roughly the same.
Bo, I have a question for you, if I may. Our National Academy in the United States recently put out a very good report on solar storms and how they can seriously damage the grid or even destroy the grid. We've had such big events before. We had one before we had an electric grid, but we had a telegraph system, and some of the operators were running the telegraph with no batteries, no power source, and some of the telegraph offices caught on fire and so on. If we had this today, it would be a disaster. What is the technical state of play on protecting long voltage DC lines from such effects?
I'm very happy I get this question now, Armour, because the first time I heard about geomagnetic storms was in Canada. We were planning a DC line, and I was responsible for control system design. I got the question, how have you mitigated geomagnetic storm? And my response was, geomagnetic what? And they say, we don't, but the question, now I know better. I can tell you, geomagnetic storm will affect AC lines, we know that. For AC line, mitigation is series capacitors. For DC lines, they are not affected at all.
On the AC lines, I believe you need a DC shunt so that you don't drive the core to saturation and then blow up the transformers.
You need to put in a capacitor in the line.
Yeah.
So,
but why is the DC line not affected at all?
Because the DC line doesn't induce this voltage, and then so if this study had been made extensively, because particularly on the north-south lines in Canada, running north-south Canada, US, and they will not be affected.
But then I don't understand how DC is induced in the AC lines, but not in the DC lines. It is induced, but it doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. You instruct me offline.
Yes, let's get offline on this subject for a moment. Any other questions? You know, I have a question about, there's a lot of debate in Japan, and actually many foreigners who visit Japan are very struck by the enormous amount of overhead cables. And the overhead is not only not beautiful, but people think it's also more dangerous. And just this morning I read a report that in Belgium they have done an analysis that the real estate prices close to transmission lines have now confirmed to be 40 to 45% below the market price. And so this really affects people. So what do we do about engineers who imagine the big grids and then the people who live on the land and actually see losses in value? What can we do? What can we say? What can we argue?
Well, if we use electricity in a way that saves money and allow distributed generation, there will be that many fewer lines. So, again, the more we have markets, the less we will have whatever that problem is. But I think people who lose value should be compensated. And this is a big issue in a lot of the United States. It's partly an aesthetic effect and partly health concerns, which are not yet fully resolved either way, but there's certainly something going on. I should also, I think, mention we haven't said very much about one aspect of the Danish grid organization, and that is they already are the most sophisticated in the world, I think, at this cellular organization of islandable microgrids. And Søren was telling me that they regularly test by cutting off the microgrid for 24 hours to make sure it actually works in a resilient way. So I would hope that a study trip to, say, the Spanish or Nord Pool control centers would include looking at that cellular organization, especially in a country with typhoons, with earthquakes. This is an extremely valuable source of national resilience.
And of course, that is a topic in many places, and it has constraints also in some time lag to put in new infrastructure. That is actually one of the reasons why it's so popular to put grid in the sea now, because there you can do it very fast. There is no 10 years lead time in building Seagrid.
Let me ask a question about this. Sonson gave this, I think it was he, that gave this wonderful slide showing the submarine telecommunications cable and said the fish can't tell the difference. But some fish navigate by electric fields. I wonder if there is any biological difference.
There is. That's another issue that has been discussed for a while. And the technology today is that all cables are actually made as double cables. So you neutralize the field, and that has been done since many years. But then coming back on the issue, it has been started again in Germany. They started, I said, the expansion of the grid. They made an interesting comparative study. If you were to build all new transmission underground, what would the cost be? And from being 0.3 cent per kilowatt hour, it turned to be 0.6. And so what I'm saying here is the technology is narrowing the gap between this. And there is also in Sweden now is planned the biggest transmission investment in Sweden now will be from central to south will be a fully underground system.
Well, and maybe some of this is made up by the...
May I interrupt? May I interrupt for a minute, please?
Very super grid type and microgrid type, which is better, but we have a proposal for that. So could you proceed to our proposal?
we still have half an hour. Don't worry, Abe-san.
My idea is both are good, but hybrid system. Why don't you think about the hybrid system? That is my proposal.
So, Sensei-san, why don't you get on then with it? Yes, Abe-san, Abe-sensei, from Tokyo University.
Allow me to speak in Japanese. It's only 5 minutes, actually. So coming back to the basics, we need to think of the issues related to renewable energy. And there are major issues that we need to consider. So let's look at the electricity structure. Sorry, it's in Japanese, but I think you'll be able to follow more or less. You have the substation, and you have high voltage, low voltage, and you have the electricity reaching the household. And now, it's often said that there's a connection in all of the different places, and there's a magnet which is rolling and 50 times per second, and in the same timing, it's facing north. And if the substation is facing north, the others generators will be north as well. So it's all connected, and the same rotation will continue to the conduit, and you will see this kind of cycle. And the transmission line is rolling in the same mode, and voltage going up and down. And with the wind power and solar added to this, the load will have this kind of fluctuation. And so it is quite different than before. And if there's impact to the power generation, there could be failures in certain places. And that being the case with this current system, what is beyond that may be influenced, because our lives are dependent on electricity. Some people, of course, would need electricity. It's a lifeline. People depend on electricity. And if there's a problem with the upstream, it's a major issue. And there would be cascading, and it could lead to large accidents and corrupt the overall system. And we see this. There was a case in Canada. I think some remember in U.S. Canada, a blackout occurred. It was back in 2003. But there are other areas. If you look at here, the numbers, you see that in major locations, you do see a lot of blackouts. This is in the unit of 1 million people. That's a suffered number. And it was 6 days ago in San Diego, Mexico. There was a blackout. and in Germany and Italy as well, though not shown here, have suffered from large blackouts. A small accident led to this big blackout. And what I was referring to as a hybrid system, now we have the grid, the trunk. That would be the trunk, and then we can bring the supergrid in. But industrially, it's important to have less expensive electricity to the industries, but at the respective cities and towns, if they can have solar PV and they can have good storage, and in the green, you see the router. This is something that I had developed. It's a power electronics device. It's actually an inverter, multi-leg inverter, actually.
Each leg has IP address, so you can send power anywhere you want. そしてそれをコントロールする
So what controls that would be the service provider. That's the system that I had envisioned as possible. So this is the power grid, internet-like power grid. And the benefit of this is that even if there's a blackout in a certain area, it will not impact the other areas. Power electronics, in a second, there will be switching about 2 million times, 20,000 times, and the supergrid and the microgrid cascading can be hybrid, in a hybrid mode. And I think the benefit of this. Before I get to the, I'm giving one more minute. In the United States, actually, there are these 3 grids and interconnections, and electrically, it's not possible to connect. We have it in 3, so if we compare U.S. and Japan, if it's in the same size, you see the microgrids in comparison, and if you connect with the routers and with the IP address, you'll be able to send electricity wherever you want. So it's like an energy internet, so to speak. And here's the cascade outage. No problem with cascade outage. And synchronous system tends to become stronger and stronger, tighter and tighter and lighter.
Not only the idea to divide semi-grid, semi-divided cells, small cells, I call it cells. そしてそこにルーターという
Router, the voltage source inverter, as was mentioned by the predecessor, inverter is placed. Then it is connected to the DC, and their address is given. Then the electricity is run. That's a system per se. It's being considered. Now my time is up. With this size, the state size to house size, it varies in various levels. It's possible to accommodate with these different sizes. I will skip this over. Now, as was shown earlier for the U.S. situation, this is a Tokyo situation. Japan, in Kanto in particular, what does color code indicate? In summer, we have these are the areas set aside for the planned blackout. As a matter of fact, electrically, this is again for each individual area. If you take out the shutter or if you turn off the lights from one area, it will go into the blackout. So you provide this inverter for the control, the new. So the electricity can be considered as a commodity, so it will be subject to the trading. So my conclusion is that the supergrid type and a microgrid type could be put into the hybrid manner. Thereby, you see the new system should be built. This is, I think, an important idea. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, there you are.
I need to learn more about this, but architecturally it's a very exciting concept and very parallel to what we talk about in the United States, where our military has decided to get off the commercial grid because it's too vulnerable to cascading failure to rely upon for the military mission continuity. There are about 20 microgrid experiments in the world. one of them, you mentioned the San Diego blackout. One of them is at the university there. And last autumn, they had a forest fire which was damaging power lines, and the university microgrid, which had been drawing 4 megawatts from the grid, was able in a half hour to reverse and send 2 megawatts back to the grid. Of course, I live in an islandable house. I don't even know when there is a power failure, and it's a wonderful sense of security, which I think many people would value. Perhaps the most interesting example on national scale, besides Denmark, of adopting a cellular architecture is Cuba. In 2005, they had 224 days of serious blackouts. In 2006, they had 3. In 2007, they had 0. And I've published a memo about this on our website, rmi.org. If you search Cuba, you will find it. They combined efficiency, inverted tariff, public education, distributed generation, and re-architecting the grid as netted islandable microgrids. They did not have any of your wonderful Todai sophistication in power electronics. They did it in a very simple way, but just that change in architecture had this profound effect on the resilience of the grid. And the 0 blackouts was despite having suddenly 2 hurricanes wipe out a lot of the grid, and still all the critical services were maintained. It's, I think, a very important illustration of the principle you describe.
Thank you. Emery, thank you very much. Any reaction to this, please? Yes, Abe-san.
Thank you. In this structure, what's good about this system, it doesn't take much time. Now, there's the grid router, as I said earlier. It is located in a transformer or in a house, in front of the houses and buildings, so that spending 10 years to draw the transformer, it is not required. So we used AC, which is available transmission line, so that the information and the power electronics can be well combined so the new structure can be made. This is the very key. So it does not take time. That is a good buy and important point. Thank you.
Yes, please. ADB-san.
Hi, this is Pribha from ADB. Yeah, I'm very much interested in this presentation. It answers to the questions that I had in mind, and I have a couple of points. a couple of questions regarding that. Number one is that is this technology commercially available, and it can be used for in our developing countries? And secondly, what would be the investment requirement to change it to this hybrid type? And the third thing is applicability of this technology. The countries that we are handling, the total generation capacity of the country is quite small, ranging from 500 megawatt to 10,000 megawatt. So whether that system can be applicable to such a small country. Thank you.
Thank you for your 3 questions. Basically, yes to all these 3 questions in principle. As for the commercial availability, around you, in every places, for air conditioner, you have an inverter installed. This technology will be used for large-scale area, as was mentioned earlier. The high DC line can be used like it was supplied by Siemens, which ABB is the world's number 1 AD/CD converter. It's commercially available for 1 million kilowatt system. It's available. Large system, for large system, it's possible. By combining this, is something that is really related to my development. It's not completely commercially available, but it's a mature technology. For the developing countries, the application is different. In the developing countries, for example, to reduce or get rid of the blackout in houses, or to get rid of the blackouts in the commercial buildings, small house microgrid, house cell, or building microgrid, or town microgrid, entity should be a starting point, so that step-by-step approach and application is possible, which is a good thing and the charm of this technology. So the transmission doesn't have to be run. A large investment is not required. These are the important approaches. Thank you.
Looks like this.
Right.
Yes. Thank you. I think we should move on to a very exciting last presentation of Mr. Kikuchi. I've been exposed to Desert Tech as a member of the Club of Rome for many, many years. And so I must even confess I didn't know there was a coordinator for Desert Tech right here in Japan. So it was to me a pleasure to learn to know you, Kikuchi-san. Please enlighten us on that visionary proposal.
How much enlightening I could give you, I'm not sure. But Desert Tech Coordinator Japan, it's a title given to me. In Germany, we're doing this in conjunction with Germany primarily. And today, I'm only giving 5 minutes. I have many slides to show, but only have 5 minutes. So firstly, I would like to emphasize the point, well, conclusion-wise, in other words. The conclusion is that in the very beginning, Son-san has said that the Asian supergrid is a concept. It surprises me. Because since the past, East Asia Community and East Asia Community and Union, whether it's possible or not, yes, I've been thinking about this for years. But the electricity network, I think it's going to be HDVC, Asia and Pacific can be connected. And so far, Hatoyama-san, former Prime Minister Mr. Hatoyama, when he was a Prime Minister, he has come up with the East Asia concept. So energy collaboration is something that we are going to put more meat and substance. I think it's going to be more practical. And during this conference, not much thing is discussed that is to the reduction of CO2. This is not something we should forget. So yes, it relates to the efficiency of electricity, but at the same time, in my thoughts, we should not be confined in one country alone for optimization. It's difficult. So regional, like Asia, Pacific, or EU, this is a unit that is needed for us to come up with the optimization finally. So in this regard, in Asia, solar grid, supergrid is very important.
And furthermore, now with the nuclear power incident, the Japanese people, we were able to respond bravely, but the government and TEPCO, they weren't able to give what they should have shown to the world, and we need to have reflections. And maybe a Asia optimum or East Asian optimum approach would need to be considered. So that's an area where we need to show and exert leadership. Without that, I think it will not be in the optimum scheme. And President Son, on the first day, was it? All of a sudden, he showed the grid, so I was a bit surprised and taken back because I thought it was going to take place within Japan first, but then it was a good surprise, actually. I hope that we will be able to move to that kind of Asian supergrid direction. Now, I think I've exhausted what I wanted to say, so I'll go real fast. And this is the Desert Tech initiative. And to explain what Desert Tech is, it's an NPO, and up to 2050, the Saharan desert solar will be used. 16% of EU electricity would be borne by that. That's the idea. And here, HVDC will be used. and 3,000 kilowatt per 10% loss or so is said to be possible and feasible. And here, this is the CO2 emission in Japan, and we don't know what 2011 will be like, but I think we need to reduce it by 300 million or so. And also, how to manage this is an issue, and we seriously need to look into this. And as was mentioned previously, it's just not renewable, but maybe coal thermal gas combined approach would lead to reduction in CO2, and CCS also would capture carbon. So we need to think of different modes to realize this. And putting aside nuclear and promotion of renewable, it's not just that, but there are other aspects that we need to consider. And this pie chart is often used, and this gives you the CO2 emission of the world, and close to 3 billion tons. And here in Asian China, you see 40% or so, represented by China and US. And at Asia, it'd be like 30% or so. So it may be difficult to reduce it by individual countries. It may be difficult to realize that per country. So that's why Asian region or Asia Pacific region concept would need to be considered. EU, of course, is looking at EU as a whole to reduce CO2, and maybe it would work for Asia. And this is the Sun Belt, and these would be the areas where Desertec will be focusing their activities. And here, this is the Asian, including Australia and Asia Pacific, 3,000 kilometers or so, 10% loss with DC, and that would be more or less the area, and there'll be about 2 energy areas. So Australia to Japan, it's about 6,000 kilometers, so that could be a difficult thing to transmit on electricity, that distance. And this is the Asia Pacific concept, such super grid concept. This is the visualization of that. So this is a pure image in terms of position and location. So the idea is to connect that, and it could separate between north and south, but I think there could be a significance in having this kind of super grid. And next, Asia and the Asian Pacific. These are the different countries. And 17 nations are shown here, 5 areas. And East Asian Summit is taking place, and it covers all of these different nations. So I think there could be a possibility in realizing such 5-area scheme. Yes. So this is the cost issue related to HVDC and electricity loss. So after exceeding a certain distance, it may be better to have DC. And Trans-Mediterranean grid. How much electricity line construction is Morocco and Spain. In between that, there's one in Tunisia and Algeria, Morocco, and Algeria and Italy. And where else? Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia and Italy, and Egypt to Crete Island to Greece. That is ongoing. And this is China. Ultra HVDC. There's quite a lot that's going on here. Can I have the rest, please? This is the overall worldwide solution by 3,000 kilometer. Within 30,000 kilometers from deserts, you have more than 9% of the world population. So the assumption is that you can use the desert sites. And here, this would be the population density in several years' time. There's about 10 locations. So energy network as such could be envisioned. What was this? Direct irradiance? I forgot. And this superimposed what I had before. And lastly, in 1980, in the 80s, actually, there was experiments conducted in Japan at Niocho in Kagawa, and PV power generation was studied. NEDO history does not show whether it was a success or failure. We don't know whether it was a success or failure. And you see that I think solar would be a good area, but the experimental sites in Japan, maybe here in Japan or maybe in deserts, I think it's important to have such experimental areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have another 10 minutes for some discussion. I would just like briefly to ask the speakers to reflect on the first discussion I had on the supergrid with Mr. Son. That was on the 2nd of August. And do you believe that by building the supergrid, it's going to be possible to slash this enormous price of cost of electricity in Japan from the price of 0.2 to the price of, 0.06 per kilowatt hour? Do you think that by connecting the supergrid, you're going to really have a price cut rather quickly in Japan? Yes.
Yes, according to what I've heard, ECBC line cost itself is not that large, and 1 kilowatt hour, 13 cents. If that is the assumption, 1 cent or so, price up could be the case.
Yeah, I think if the goal is to reduce electricity prices, then the first thing you do is unbundle the utilities and the transmission, and you create a real market. And you allow a wide diversity of renewable power sources to be connected to the grid and make sure everybody can sell their electricity in the first instance. And that would be, and interconnect, obviously, the different areas in Japan. Then there may be advantages going forward to interconnecting with other places where trading in bulk might make sense. But that should be ultimately an economic decision based on the project economics of the individual transmission link rather than through some grand master plan, because you can see that there's potentially cheap electricity here and you want to bring it here. It doesn't work that way in real life. There's an awful lot of work to do here, I think, before, which doesn't mean that in the longer run that's not necessary, not useful. Certainly, from the point of view of a country like Mongolia, it could be very useful. Creating an export product for them. But I think there's an awful lot we can do here in the very short term at home before we can talk about which will impact the price.
Very good. Questions from the audience. We got to finish right on time. Actually, I think I've been told I should finish 1 minute before the end. Questions? Yes. Sean.
Thank you. There appear to be very strong analogies to the internet with the grid of the future, and also in some cases, such as Abe-sensei, actually implementing terminology into your product based on internet terminology. So with that in mind, with the trend in the internet space going more towards cloud computing and sort of off-siting your storage, in 20 years' time, what should we expect in terms of the proportion of storage in someone's house where they are an island and they can push electricity back into the grid when there is a failure, such as in Amory's case, or how much of that is going to be stored in the servers of the power sites and whatnot? What's the sort of balance there that you all see 20 years from now? Thank you.
In Japanese, I would like to answer this question. The storage capacity, how much storage capacity is going to be? Well, you cannot foresee This, I don't know, beyond me. In this time period, I don't know how I can say. The price of the thing is dependent on the volume of production, has nothing to do with the time access, as you know already. So accumulated production vis-a-vis the cost, this relationship is to be borne in mind. And as for the different analogy, the power generation, this actual behavior is what suits the production of electricity. So the production concept is that the consumption, it is another side of a consumption. So if it is consumed, we produce the same amount of the consumption. In other words, in terms of the analogy, again, the consumers will buy this. Against this, the same amount of production capacity facilities needed. We don't have a warehouse. We don't have a stored amount. Zero storage, a production style. The inventory or stock is room for the unemployment. If we have too much things on the stock, it is wasteful. Without stock, however, you have to have a wasteful production capacity. So the appropriate level of a stock is what people have in mind. So this concept is also applicable to the storage. Appropriate storage level, depending upon the region and place and the production, whether it's a wind or solar power, it differs by the type of the power species. This is my answer. Thank you.
Electricity is the ultimate example of just-in-time production. I think the surprise we found in our own simulations and those of many others around the world is that there is not a strong case for bulk storage of electricity. So where you do it, the question doesn't really arise. But it is extremely useful to have distributed storage in electrified automobiles, and my talk Monday explained an economic path to do that with a great competitive advantage to the auto industry. If you want to look into this, go to rmi.org and in the search box enter Smart Garage. We did an open source industry workshop a couple of years ago that speeded things up some years, I think, in how smart vehicles can exchange both electricity and information with a smart grid through smart buildings, and all three parties can make money.
Okay.
But my own suspicion is that when we've done all the math, we may well find that less storage or backup is required in a well-run, diverse, distributed, renewable system than the utilities have already installed and paid for to cope with the intermittence of the big thermal stations.
Thank you. Bo, short remark?
Very short. I would like to support what was said before here, that you have to look at the total system, heat and electricity. I believe very much in combining heat and electricity systems, also when it comes to storage.
Yes, last small comment.
I am Arakawa of Tokyo University. As to the storage, the distributed storage or heat, in addition to the usage, there we have in Japan, for the nuclear power station, we see the new use of a nuclear power. If this is in suspended mode, we would like to utilize the pump system. So I always make this proposal, but the electric company has not understood this. I hope that they would utilize the pump-up system or pump system of the water.
Using the power of the chair to conclude this meeting, I've certainly learned an awful lot as a very ignorant person about all the engineering and all the concepts. I even had to go to Bo and say, what does that acronym mean? Because this is also a sector which is riddled with acronyms, where you very often have to wonder what it actually says. I'm not going to make a conclusion. We will see each other in 1 minute's time at the brunch site. Please, the organizers, the brunch site is... Tell us where it is. We just go to the end of the hallway. go out, meeting room number 3. Okay? We see each other there in 45 seconds. Thank you. Thank you, and a hand of applause for our panel members.